And then with that, that gets all of our housekeeping out of the way. We'll go ahead and start with our first speaker, Channah Rock from U of A Department of Environmental Science. And her presentation is on adjacent land use, potential impacts of fresh produce food safety, and key learnings. I see you're already here, so I'll go ahead and I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. So let me get my slides up on the screen and we can get going. All right, does that look okay to everyone?
Looks good to me.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. As you just said, my name is Dr. Channah Rock. I'm a water quality specialist with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. A big part of our jobs and the work that we do is related to working side by side with industry to better understand potential impacts, and more specifically with me related to food safety. We also work really, really hard to take their questions from the field or things that they're experiencing, translate that back into research questions that we can do lab work, we can do field work, we can work with other colleagues at the University of Arizona, and then take that data that we're generating and then translate that back into solutions for industry. So we're kind of the middleman. We also work really closely with the regulatory community. So we've got great relationships with the FDA and the CDC, also with the Arizona Department of Health, and then also with the Arizona Department of Agriculture. And so oftentimes we work side by side with these entities, right, to figure out root cause and to determine what potential problems might be occurring in the fresh produce industry. So what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today are some recent issues that have arisen as an outcome of recent outbreaks and recent outbreak investigations, specifically related to fresh produce and leafy greens. If you all remember, in 2018, one of the largest outbreaks that we had seen, specifically tied to leafy greens and specifically related to E. coli 0157H7, was traced back to some farms here in Arizona. And so since then, we were really trying to hone in on industry practices, but also knowing that the industry here in the state of Arizona and also in California is really heavily regulated and self-monitored through the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement. And so basically that's a partnership with the states and also the growers and shippers to raise the bar on food safety, to implement monitoring programs and best management practices to keep produce safe. And so knowing that the farms that were potentially involved were following LGMA, it kind of shifted our focus to look at some additional things that maybe we hadn't been paying close enough attention to historically and in the past. Obviously, I'm a water quality specialist, so water is at the top of that list. A lot of folks, including the FDA and the CDC, tend to focus on water quite a bit as a potential vector, right, for moving pathogens in and around the environment. But we had records and historical documentation that the water quality at that point in time during the 2018 season was acceptable. There was also water treatment that was occurring. And so again, kind of shifting our focus away from water and trying to identify some potential other routes of contamination. And thus that tried to shift into looking at adjacent land use. And so if any of you have read any of the more recent documentation coming out of the FDA related to the Food Safety Modernization Act, or documentation from the FDA or CDC related to outbreak investigations in other areas, you'll kind of repeatedly see this term adjacent land use and this focus on adjacent land use. And I think that's because of some of the work that we've been doing. So just to dive in, why the focus on adjacent land use, right? We had this 2018 outbreak that I just mentioned. But when we started to dive into that specific outbreak strain, what we've noticed is that that strain has been found in NCBI and in some of these national databases of microbiology for over 4 years. So it's kind of been repeated and being able to see this in multiple food products and multiple locations across the United States. And actually, if we went into NCBI today and we were to look at the specific strain, you would now see that it has grown dramatically in locations. So what we call this is a persistent strain. And these isolates and this strain specifically has now been assigned a rep code, a repeating code. And this has been assigned by the CDC and the FDA. So there's two rep strains right now. There's one that kind of has been tagged to the 2018 outbreak of O157H7, and the other rep strain, which is rep EXH02, has been tied to outbreaks in the Salinas growing region. So anyway, it kind of caused us to think about, well, why does the get around strain? Why is this strain something that we're seeing out in the environment and kind of repeatedly over time in multiple different locations, and thinking about, again, vehicles of potential transmission. So I pulled out, some of the more recent outbreaks that have been linked or suspected through multiple vehicles for this rep strain. And I've got them listed, and I won't go through all of them, but you can see we have recreational water in one, obviously romaine in 2018. You'll see suspected ground beef a couple of times. In summer of 2019, there was an outbreak linked to a petting zoo with lambs that actually was in California. We saw this again in 2020, 2021 with an unknown vehicle, and then more recently also in 2021 with power greens. So, and also not only in the state of Arizona. So it begs questions, right, related to if we're going to solve problems about this strain, and if we're going to reduce the potential impact on leafy greens and food safety, where do we need to be looking really to focus in on root cause and find solutions? So some of the ongoing questions that we have related to this specific strain are, do the differences in that genetics represent a specific animal reservoir, potentially geographic regions or vehicles? And so do we see similarities or differences in the genetics of that strain? Lots of folks have poked questions and asked about the role of migratory birds and potential transport and dispersion of this strain. We joke we always need to get t-shirts that say it's not the birds, but potentially it is the birds. But we get lots and lots of questions about the birds, and potentially, could there be a mechanism that we see with migratory birds and transport and moving this strain around, especially in the corridor that we see between Arizona and California. We also asked the question, does the diverse rep strain represent O157 strains that have been adapted to cattle and other ruminants or animals in the Western United States? So again, after the 2018 outbreak, we had a lot of questions that were circulating and hypotheses about animal feeding operations. There's a large CAFO down in the Welton area that a lot of attention was paid to. But we were also starting to think about, because again, we see this geographic diversity, what do movement of cattle across the United States look like? And where are the feeder cattle coming from for feedlots? And how long do they stay there? And lots of questions related to cattle and other ruminant animals, just because we did see ground beef pop up a couple of times, specifically with this strain. And then the last question I'll just pose for you all to kind of think about is, do we see this strain persisting in animals or in the environment? And then ultimately, right, the goal that we have working with growers in cooperative extension, can we mitigate that with best management practices? If we can't eliminate it completely, right, as the source, are there ways that it can be mitigated if potentially there's a reservoir for this strain out in the environment? Obviously, we grow crops out in the environment and they're exposed to a lot of different things. And so again, that's not going to be able to be changed to be able to feed the massive amounts of population with controlled environment agriculture. And although some folks think that might be a safer or a less risky practice, there's certainly issues that we've seen and outbreaks that we've seen with produce grown under glass. So because specifically in Arizona, we support, we're the lettuce growing capital of the US. in largely North America in the winter months. So in a couple of weeks, we'll start harvesting, and all that will shift from California to Arizona. So how can we potentially mitigate these strains that we're seeing in the environment if in fact they've got a reservoir built up? So one of the big things, and I told you, a lot of the work that I do is with agriculture water. And so thinking about best management practices or mitigation strategies, obviously water and the way that we use water, the way that we treat water is one of those areas of focus. So recently, the FDA, in their published reports, and hopefully some of you guys have seen some of those, have really had strong language about implications of irrigation water as potential sources of those outbreak strains. We've seen through the LGMAs in California and Arizona pretty stringent water treatment metrics. So what this requires for Arizona and California LGMA is that within 21 days to harvest of a leafy green, that's any leafy green, that water must be treated and treated basically to drinking water standards. So that's through the use of chemistries like chlorine dioxide, peroxyacetic acid, and also UV light are common chemistries and devices that are commonly used to treat water. And then again, more recently, the Food Safety Modernization Act through FDA proposed Subpart E asks growers to conduct what's called an agriculture water assessment, or an AGWA. And basically what that assessment does, it helps growers to evaluate potential hazards and those hazards and how they may impact agriculture water quality. It talks about two mitigations, whether that's irrigation and then allowing a set period of time for die-off of the microbes that might be in that water, or treatment. So treatment is an option. But again, there's this language that we start to see again, this focus on adjacent land use. So really this shift in just managing a problem to potentially identifying the root cause of those problems and trying to figure out if that can be managed. So through this agriculture water assessment, growers are asked a number of different questions, but again, a focus on adjacent land use. So talking about the slope of the land, talking about animals, talking about riparian habitat. So all the things that potentially could tick up that potential risk factor, and asking growers to do that. So you can imagine that a grower is not just a grower anymore, right? So they're a grower, they're a water treatment operator, they are a food safety specialist, they are someone who works in animal agriculture. So now you're adding this burden, and we could debate right or wrong about the number of additional jobs that a grower might have, or the responsibilities that they have. And so again, a lot of the work that we do is to provide them with the skills and the knowledge so that they can do these types of jobs. Again, water treatment, just to kind of reiterate some of that, right? It's always been an option under the produce safety rule with FSMA, either as a routine operating procedure, so something that growers would just do, or as a corrective measure. So say they took a water sample and exceeded a certain value, then they could use water treatment as a corrective measure to be able to manage that. But again, with the proposed rule and the language, we're kind of still waiting. We thought that the finalized language would be out. They really only have now the outcomes of that agriculture water assessment to drive their decisions. However, you can imagine how subjective that might be. So if I were to go out to conduct an ag water assessment, I'm certainly going to see things much differently because I'm a microbiologist. I try to think about pathogens and how they move, and think like a pathogen and how they're moving throughout the environment. Again, a grower or food safety manager is going to think a little bit differently. Obviously, they're going to know their systems much more in depth, but we certainly are going to think differently, and certainly going to think differently than the regulatory community. So if FDA or Arizona Department of Ag has an inspector that comes down to be able to conduct an agriculture water assessment, what is that going to look like, and how subjective that might be. And so really, again, we're trying to give growers the knowledge, right, to be able to do this on their own, but also kind of the confidence to push back, or the confidence to say that they believe what they believe and they made decisions and have a justification for that, because ultimately that's what they're going to have to share and prove to the regulatory body. So again, kind of some initial thoughts related to adjacent land use, because again, we've seen this shift in language. And so these are some of the things that we're starting to teach growers in the grower community related to adjacent land use. So this picture on the bottom right, we obviously in Arizona, we're familiar with these intense windstorms. This is a haboob that occurred. I forget what year it occurred, but you can see that's a CAFO animal feeding operation. You know, there's adjacent lands of agriculture, and then you have this intense windstorm that's coming through. So some of the things that we're thinking about with weather, obviously temperature, humidity, wind speed, direction, but what are we thinking about calling things as extreme? So what are we thinking about setting thresholds related to some of these potential things that I've got listed here for their ability to transport pathogens from one place to another? So obviously animal feeding operations, you have manure, you're going to have potential pathogens there. And so what are some of the things that might occur within the weather that could potentially transport them? So a big shift in our thinking about wind and what we call like rogue dust that might be moving in and around and translocating dust particles and associated pathogens. We also think about rain and runoff, and super fortunate, right, that in Arizona we don't have a ton of rain to worry about from this perspective. Obviously, we would love to have more rain in the environment here, but from a runoff perspective, we don't really see too big of an issue. And when we do have rain events, we can really identify those issues quickly. So again, shifting a mindset to think about how pathogens might move. We also think about water use and conveyance activities related to where the water might pass by, what might be adjacent to. And I'm going to show some pictures here in a minute related to some water use and conveyance activities and natural features like bridges and berms and land slope, and how that potentially could impact the quality of water and ultimately the potential presence for pathogens. And then lastly, just to kind of reiterate, well, we also think about people too. So obviously we focus a lot on animals and the potential for animals and wildlife and domesticated animals to potentially spread pathogens in and around the environment. But people are gross, and we obviously have waste streams and other things that we can also contribute to as well. And so now, again, we're kind of shifting a grower's thinking to think about not only the animal agriculture, but also people and human influence as well. So here's some pictures. That's my previous graduate student, Natalie Brossel. She's now an assistant in extension. We do a lot of water quality monitoring, a lot of surface water quality monitoring, and really to hone in on different locational features or landscape features that could potentially influence or be drivers for degradation in water quality. So most of the irrigated agriculture in the state of Arizona is irrigated from surface water. And these surface waters, a largely Colorado River, is managed through a series of canal systems. And so they can be lined with concrete or they can be unlined, so kind of earthen lined like the one you see on the bottom right. And they can be mains, laterals. You can also have ponds or reservoirs that are also storing that water. So a lot of the work that we've done to date is getting out into the field, collecting samples, refining methodologies, but really trying to hone in on, do we see repeated differences in these different types of water conveyance structures? And does their location matter for our ability to find either indicator organisms like generic E. coli or total coliform bacteria, or the pathogens themselves like E. coli 157 or Salmonella? Other things that we're starting to think about and trying to assign risk values to are landscape features. So is this canal in an urban area? Is it in a rural area? And I'll say the big thing related to that is the potential for runoff from an urban area. We also think about septic systems and the potential for septic seepage into water conveyance structures that are going to be used for agriculture. I mentioned animal operations like CAFOs or ranches. Oftentimes we only think about the really big guys, right? The giant ones that potentially could be impacting our environmental quality, but we're also thinking about the hobby farms. So the folks that have, chickens in their backyards and, goats or maybe one or two horses. How are they managing that manure? How are they stockpiling it? Where is it being stockpiled? Is there runoff from their irrigation system into a canal structure? So, not only those big guys, but the little guys as well are things that we have to pay attention to. Related to that is land slope. So, are we seeing these canal structures and these water conveyances built up so that you don't have potential for runoff? Or is it at the bottom of a hill where you have housing or septics or something where that natural path would be to move water from high to low ground? Again, I'll talk a little bit about these bridge structures, and there's one across the top and it's just cars moving across. But when we went to investigate a little bit further, there's these lovely, adorable little bird nests that are all lined all under that bridge. And so if those birds have that as a population in an area where they're roosting and they're defecating directly into the water below, that's a potential issue for downstream users, especially if that water is being used for produce. Also, we think about canal width and depth. So some of these structures are very wide, like you would imagine, hundreds of feet wide, and some are very narrow and small. So if it's a main, like the ones that Natalie is standing next to, they're going to be pretty wide. If it's a lateral, that's something that's coming onto a farm or our ranch, and they're going to be pretty narrow. Related to that, think about water movement and temperature of that water, as well as sediment and algae and all these things that potentially could impact water quality. So the smaller those canals get, the warmer the water gets, the increased likelihood that we see in pathogens' ability to persist. So again, thinking about things like that. We've also, and I talked about this just briefly, about lined and unlined canals. You would imagine that unlined canals that don't have that concrete lining are going to potentially be lower water quality. And in some cases, that's the case, but not always. But we do see shifts and changes with the amount of vegetation that's present, and also thinking about other amphibians that like to live in that vegetation, whether that be frogs or fish. Obviously some of those animals or amphibians carry salmonella with them. And so again, there's lots of different things to kind of consider with adjacent land use and surrounding areas that we have to be thinking about. So a lot of questions, again, with water get pushed back on to the irrigation district. So the job of an irrigation district is to supply a volume of water to a specific location and time. However, there's things that they can be doing to help mitigate potential issues and problems. So again, we spend a lot of time with irrigation districts talking about the way that they're managing their canal system. So thinking about setup, buildup over time along the bottom of those canals and the potential that might serve as a reservoir for pathogens. We just talked about, the animals and reptiles and other amphibians that can live in invasive plants and algae. And so thinking about removal or thinking about management of those, right, to reduce the potential for those pathogens to persist. But however, if you remove a bunch of vegetation, you're going to have issues with bank stabilization, especially in those unlined areas. So again, unintended consequence, something to think about. And really for those smaller canals, we really have to start thinking about stagnant water. There's been a lot of issues recently where, we've had stagnant water that has been in really small canal systems. So say a lateral, and you have a grower that will have used fertilizer, right? So they'll add nutrients to that water before they irrigate their crop. Those residual nutrients are basically food for bacteria, right? And so if there's any potential pathogens or either indicator bacteria in that water, or say you have an amphibian like a frog or something like that, that potentially can be an issue and considered a breeding ground for salmonella. And so we've seen that a number of times. So again, starting to think about water management and stagnant water and prevent those practices from occurring. So here's some great pictures from the irrigation district in Welton, so the Welton Mohawk Irrigation and Drainage District. On the left-hand side is some grates, and they're removing some of the particulates that can be caught against that grate system. And then on the right-hand side, they're doing what's called dredging. So they're removing sediment and algae and any kind of particulates that are in the bottom of that lateral there. The big thing related to this is that it's really imperative that they're not doing this during the growing season. So they're not doing this when irrigation water is being used. So if they can be shifting this towards the end of the season, so towards the summer months, that's going to be good, because you can imagine all this increased activity of your water structures in your canal system. That's going to resuspend potential bacteria that might be in those sediments or in those particulates and cause problems downstream for irrigation and also treatment. Here's another picture also from the same district that was doing kind of bank stabilization and cleaning up of some of the vegetation that was on some of these banks. And really the reason was at that time was that there were a lot of birds and other animals that were living in these trees and bushes that were on adjacent to this canal. So if you have animals and they're defecating and they're right there adjacent to the water, that potentially could be an issue into the future. So I'm going to leave this picture up. If we were in person, I would ask you if you see any issues here. So take a look at that. This is the after picture. On the right-hand side is the canal. And then you just kind of see dirt sitting there. And this is what it looked like not too much before that. So irrigation canal, that is either composted or non-composted material that had been staged next to or adjacent to the irrigation canal. And the potential issue here, right, is that there might be pathogens in this composted or non-composted material. And, trucks drive by or a little bit of wind, and that's going to relocate into the irrigation system and into the water, and so potentially cause issues. So again, not a hard management practice to be able to talk to those material haulers and ask them to stage these in different areas. Obviously, organic amendments like this are super important for leafy greens producers and organic producers, right? These are non-synthetic fertilizers, but there's potential issues with those. And so timing is important and placement is very important. So again, trying to get people to shift their thinking a little bit. Another thing that we're trying to teach folks about too is to talk to their neighbors a bit more. So what are your neighbors up to? So thinking about what crop products are being applied either in the off season or during your season on surrounding lands. So on the left-hand side is a picture of compost turning. So completely fine, absolutely okay. But let's just say that it's a really windy day and you're turning the compost, so that's not fully composted. So there could be potentially pathogens there. It gets kicked up into the air, and then that might either get into your water system or onto your leaf surface or onto the land. So a potential BMP would be to not turn compost on windy days above a certain threshold. Obviously, the animal industry and the vegetable industry are both important parts of our economy, and they both need to survive and thrive. But what are ways that we can be good neighbors? On the right-hand side is poultry litter application. So a lot of folks use composted poultry pellets or heat-treated poultry pellets. I'll just say that Hickman's is a huge supplier of poultry pellets to the fresh produce industry in the state of Arizona, which is fantastic. It's a fantastic source of nitrogen that we can put back into the soil for beneficial use. But you might not want to be doing poultry application on a day that is also windy or adjacent to a crop that's going to be harvested in the next couple of days. So again, really trying to talk to your neighbors, figure out what they're doing and what they're up to, and trying to provide some guidance on when that might be appropriate. So here's an example of some work that we did, again, thinking about wind and thinking about movement and translocation of some of these particulates in the air. So again, in irrigation canal, we've kind of blocked out who they are. We set up these really inexpensive, kind of rudimentary methods to catch particulates in the air. That's just sterile cheesecloth strung across two wooden stakes. We leave these out for a certain number of hours. And so the left-hand picture, it doesn't look too, dirty. Yes, it might be a little bit brown. The right-hand picture, it's a little bit worse, but if you kind of zoom into that, look at all that particulate that's there. So particulates is one thing, right? That's not a food safety issue. But what we've done is we've been able to take these cheesecloth, bring them back to the laboratory, enrich them, right? Give them food for the bacteria to survive, and be able to pull out pathogens from these. So whether that's salmonella or other Shiga toxin producing E. coli or O157 itself. So again, a lot of folks, had not paid a ton of attention to potential for wind and atmospheric deposition or transfer throughout the environment. And we've been able to kind of document and better understand that this is a potential issue and could cause potential problems as they're moving into the future. Again, this is another picture that was taken after a super windy day. So basically what happens in these irrigation systems and canals, you have a series of gates or I'll just say gates, and they're basically small bridges that go across these irrigation systems. And basically at these locations, water speed slows down a bit. And because of that slowing nature of that water, you can really kind of capture and kind of see the potential impact of these windy days and deposition on that water surface. And because of the water tension, all of that particulates are just kind of sitting there. So again, what we've been able to do is to go into these irrigation districts to sample along their water column, but also collect samples specifically of these films that have formed or kind of particulates that have aggregated in these areas. And what you see is dramatic differences in the numbers of organisms that we're finding in these films versus what we're actually seeing in the water column below. And so the problem becomes is that these films get so heavy to a point that they've accumulated and then they drop out. And so they actually get resuspended back down into that water column. So again, what's the best management practice, right? Maybe it's you don't irrigate 24 hours after a windy day, or if you see things like this, you talk to the district and you try to get this cleaned up in a way. So again, just trying to make folks a little bit more aware of the potential that we see for pathogens moving in and around the environment, and specifically in dust and air. So here's an example of something that's called the Good Neighbors. It's a Good Neighbor program put on by the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement. This is an example in Arizona. And it's just kind of a reminder, right, that not all of your neighbors are in produce. Not all of your neighbors know that you're going to be harvesting produce right now. So this is a publication that was put out, and they had some great pictures associated with it as well about compost delivery, stockpiling, and handling, and just trying to make adjacent land use folks be aware that these could potentially cause issues for food safety. And it's as simple as that, right? It doesn't have to be overly complex solutions, but it can be very kind of straightforward. But a lot of this is about communication and just raising the level of awareness that folks have about their activities and the potential issues that they may cause from a food safety perspective. So obviously wildlife and animals, these are kind of the pictures that we don't want to see, but it happens, right? Animals out in the desert and out in the environment obviously seek water sources, and canal structures are a water source that they're going to seek. So we know that animal movement patterns shift and change throughout the year. We also know climate and seasonal impacts on water availability could potentially motivate some of those animals to seek out alternative water sources. And so here's some extreme pictures, right? But ways that we can do this, and we've been working with Arizona Game and Fish and the wildlife folks about offering up watering areas that are not the canals, obviously, but alternative areas that animals do have access to water during extreme or stressed times of the year. And so that potentially could dramatically increase the amount of potential wildlife that are falling into canals, but also communication, right? So if this occurs, what type of communication is going on between the irrigation districts, between Arizona Game and Fish, and then also between the fresh produce industry? So again, they don't have to be overly complex solutions, but just kind of common sense, straightforward issues about communication and notation. So again, maybe we don't irrigate within 72 hours after this has occurred. Maybe if you do have animal intrusion into your irrigation canals, that's going to trigger you to go collect water samples to assess them for the potential presence of indicator organisms and or pathogens. So again, some kind of triggers or some thresholds or actions that could be taken to help potentially mitigate. I mentioned the wild birds earlier. Again, this is kind of an extreme picture. This is a crop of romaine that's kind of they've let go, they've let it gone to seed. They're not going to harvest this, but because of that, all of these birds have just decided that this is the place that they want to be, either for the seeds or either for the insects that are on this crop. So we're starting to ask questions about when birds arrive and when do they leave? Where do they usually roost or land? And typically what we see, that's usually close to water or bridges or trees or things like that. So can we reduce their potential roosting activities around water sources so they're not defecating directly into the water? And can you provide alternates to that? Or can you potentially sample and try to investigate if they're potentially causing an issue? So that was, this was this bridge. One of the interesting things about this, if you look at the timestamp on this, this was taken at 10:16 a.m. When we go out to sample, we sample super, super early in the morning because it's hot during different times of the month. So when we had sampling teams out, they were out at 6 a.m. They had looked under the bridge. There were no birds under the bridge. They didn't note that that was an issue. But one of our team members had decided, actually it was Game and Fish, they set up trail cameras and they were looking at bird activity in lots of different areas. And lo and behold, at around 10 a.m., all the birds returned after their morning meal or their morning flight. And this was just their hangout. So again, it really depends upon the time of day that some of these observations are occurring. So when we're talking to industry about conducting, agriculture water assessments, you don't just do it at one time of the year or one time during the day. You need to be out there looking at multiple different times, multiple different folks, and potentially trying to capture the variability that might occur out in the environment. And I think this is lastly, people, do you know what's happening upstream? So, this, I think this is the Salt River. So, tubing, maybe it's not the Salt River, it looks a little wide. But do you know what's happening upstream? Are there activities of people in and around your water sources and in the environment that are potentially causing degradation of your water quality? Not all of those people are getting out to use the restroom. And so potentially, do you see degradation occurring? If you think about Yuma and the Colorado River, we're at the bottom. There are, I forget off the top of my head, but I think it's something like 56 wastewater treatment outfalls by the time we get down to the Yuma growing region. So although that is all treated, wastewater, they could be treated to different standards, whether it's A+, B+, or B. So again, there's potential for pathogens to be moving in and around your water sources from domestic sources and from people. So, it's scary, right? To think about all the things that a grower can't control, and yet they're charged with protecting food safety and growing a safe and nutritious crop for communities and their own families. So what can they do? So we teach them to be aware of their surroundings and upstream land use activities. Obviously, talk to your neighbors. That was a really big one that's kind of come out of a lot of this work. We are really trying to see a shift in communication between the irrigation districts and the growing community. So really encouraging irrigation districts to conduct maintenance activities well before preseason assessments occur. So really trying to do all of that work in the off season, so you're not going to see an impact to that on food safety. Because we are water quality specialists and because we work really closely with industry, we've been teaching them to recognize they might need to flush their ditches or their laterals or their water delivery systems if there are potential issues upstream. So if you have stagnant water, if you have, a ton of animal activity, if there's been issues historically, if you had a really windy day the day before, really try to manage that to your best ability. But then also recognize, obviously, I've talked a lot about water here today, but it's not always the water, right? And there's other mechanisms and ways that these pathogens can be transported around. So again, kind of related to animal agriculture and some of the things that we've been seeing recently, trying to determine what some mitigation measures might be from the ranching community and from the rancher side. So whether that's a large animal operation or just a small hobby farm. So low or no cost mitigation measures, right? Think about best practices for pens and of those animals, routine water trucks really for dust abatement and being able to manage that. For compost best practices, you saw those pictures of the turning compost and those particulates up in the air. So thinking about dust management, vehicle traffic and density, where they're moving, when they're moving, the timing of the water, when that runoff might be occurring. So again, it's really about communication. It's really thinking about the activities that you're doing and the potential it could impact your neighbors and your neighbors from animal operations being produce production. And then reducing or eliminating work on those windy days. And, is it appropriate to set a threshold of something like 10 miles per hour or 15 miles per hour? And obviously that's going to be site specific, and there'll need to be scientific documentation to say that that actually is an acceptable mitigation measure. Some medium investments, thinking about barriers or berms for dust containment from those compost operations, and maybe rethinking locations of unfinished compost yards or staging. So can some land swaps occur? Can we potentially move those potential sources of pathogens away from areas where that might be potentially too close to produce production? I will say currently under the LGMA, there is an agreed upon setback distance from fresh produce to animal operations for growing, and that's a 2-mile setback distance. And right now what we're doing is we're working on building up scientific data to say, yes, 2 miles is appropriate, or what, we need to go further out. Or, what, we could probably bring produce back in. So up until, maybe 10 years ago, maybe even a little less than that, you could grow produce right adjacent, right up, within a couple 100 feet of an animal operation. And so because of the increased potential risk that is present with animal operations to fresh produce, they've decided to push that back to 2 miles. Now, that was just an arbitrary measure. It wasn't based in science or in data. And so again, we're working with industry to try to refine that and to make sure that that's appropriate. And if it's not, to be able to have data to push that back a little bit further. So I know I'm ending a couple minutes early. Obviously, we have time for questions. My email is here up on the screen. I'm happy to answer any questions either now or kind of into the future as you guys are thinking through this, but I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work that we do and some of the hard work that industry does to get leafy greens to your plate. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. We do actually have a series of questions for you here.
Awesome.
Okay. The first one here, let me move this over. Who conducts the ag water assessment? Is it the grower or a third party? Are there any requirements for how that assessment is done?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, the rule hasn't been finalized, but if and when it is finalized and the ag water assessment is there, it is the grower. Sometimes they will hire out a third party. And there are some very specific questions that have to be answered, and then also documentation. And then what will happen depending upon the state that you're in. So specifically for the state of Arizona, the Arizona Department of Agriculture has inspectors that will come out to verify that that was done correctly and identify if there's any areas for improvement.
Awesome. Let's see. Is the focus for adjacent land use only on outbreaks? I'm thinking about the major freeways right next to agriculture in Phoenix. Any concern for pollutants?
Yeah, great question. So I'm a microbiologist, right? So I think about the pathogens, the potential mechanisms of transport for pathogens. So typically, right, we're just thinking about potential routes for those. I wouldn't see any major issues with freeways and cars and vehicles, but there could certainly be other pollutants that could be transported because of them, right? And you might see a shift in some thinking there. But great question.
Awesome. Are you suggesting the dust storms can carry pathogens to new areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the work that we've done, we've been able to kind of prove that, if we have pathogen sources in one area, we can see those pathogens moving and being translocated to certain distances away. Um, that have been associated with some severe wind events. I'm not going to say all dust storms, and certainly you have to have a pathogen source to be able to monitor that. But certainly we've been able to monitor and measure that. And then also there's a graduate student of Kristen Progreva Brown down at the U of A that has also been doing some work correlating atmospheric events with pathogen presence and persistence in the environment and population.
Awesome. Let's see. Water was mentioned to be in compliance with regulatory requirements. Has a soil composition study been considered?
Yeah, so currently soil sampling is not a requirement under the Food Safety Modernization Act. What is required though, and there are very strict guidelines about the use or non-allowance of the use of compost and manures related to fresh produce production. So there are certain timing requirements or full out not allowed. So uncomposted manure cannot be used to grow fresh produce. And then if you are using composted manure, there's certain setback times. 60 days is one, 100 days is another.
Perfect. What is the concentration of pathogens in undeveloped / not in use and desert areas? Are these wind transported?
Yeah, so I would say it's very rare for us to be able to find pathogens in undeveloped or non-in-use desert areas. So specifically, I'm thinking about pathogens like Salmonella and also pathogens like E. coli 157H7. However, if you're thinking about a pathogen like Listeria, we naturally find that in the environment. We naturally find that in soils. I'm not going to say that they're all wind transported because some of these are just naturally occurring, or it really depends on the potential for animals to be in and around these areas.
All right, next question. What are the current regulations for animal agriculture waste disposal? Are there efforts for increased regulation to reduce risk of water contamination?
Yeah, absolutely. So animal agriculture is very heavily regulated. Most, if not all, have requirements for zero liquid discharge. So they have to be managing their liquid waste on site. And then in lots of cases for animal agriculture, they're doing composting operations to be able to reduce the microbial populations in their waste products before they're moved off of their own property. There are also PM, so particulate matter, PM10, PM2.5 regulations, specifically for animal operations to try to reduce the potential for degradation of air quality. And they're monitored and regulated by the USDA.
All right. Next question is, if dust control can be as simple as alternative practices, is there a financial incentive?
Yeah, so I was going to say dust control can be simple, but it also can be, pretty complex, right? So if it's dust management to keep dust down on adjacent roads or things like that, that's fine. If we're thinking about larger areas, obviously we're not going to put up barriers around every farm, that grows produce. And so that would be, pretty cost intensive. Additionally around animal operations, it's going to be pretty cost intensive to be able to create berms or barriers there. So yeah, it's a trade-off. And then I think the other thing is who pays. So does the animal operation pay for that, or do the fresh produce growers pay for that, or does the irrigation district pay for that? And so those are some of the conversations that we're having. Can there be some shared governance and some shared responsibility?
Interesting. Are mitigation efforts on the rancher's side enforceable, or are they just guidance?
Yeah, so the LGMA really is just metrics for guidance for one level. However, what happens there is that the marketplace drives the enforcement. So if, for example, a grower is not meeting LGMA metrics, that is published, and then someone like Costco can say, I am only going to buy produce from LGMA members that are within compliance. And so the marketplace is a pretty important driver for compliance of some of these metrics. I'll say on the FSMA side, so Food Safety Modernization Act, those are enforceable through the state and then through the FDA. And so there's different opportunities there for being able to pull product off of and out of the marketplace if there's an egregious issue that has been noted. But there's also opportunities to bring folks back up into compliance. So there's different mechanisms for enforcement.
All right. How are crops in the field treated? Preventative, perhaps? Is it possible, or do the growers only have the option to treat after production slash harvest?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I said, with the leafy greens marketing agreement, there's requirements to treat water within 21 days to harvest. And so that is something that would happen before, a product is harvested out of the field. So that is the idea, is potentially to reduce the exposure of these crops. But currently there are no treatments in the field, kind of things that would be able to address if pathogens are already on the plant surface, and you're applying a product to be able to reduce those. I think the majority of whole head products that you see is straight from the field into the bag and to your door. If you're buying a salad product or something that's already been chopped up and mixed, that's all gone through a series of wash steps and sometimes a series of sanitizers that might be applied to those. So if you look at the bag and it says ready to eat or triple rinse or triple wash, those are options that they've been treated after harvest.
All right. The next one, popular topic, a lot of questions. Have you tested alternative methods of farming? Is it feasible in our climate region to not do open plowing / equipment stirred dust production?
Ooh, that's a great question. I am not a grower. However, I think a lot of folks are working on low-till or no-till farming practices, not necessarily from a dust perspective, but just from the perspective of maintaining soil health and soil quality. The more you till land over and over and over again, you can't grow crops there. So you have to put back in organic matter and nutrients. And so the low till or no till methods would be from that perspective. But that's interesting to think about from a stirred up dust perspective.
Definitely. There must be a base concentration of nearly all pathogens. How do you tease out the pertinent information? That is, the concentrations that are meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge question, huge question that we have. So every, the regulators don't like to hear this sometimes, but every surface water in the entire world has pathogens in them, but the concentration drives your risk profile. So right now, when we think about metrics related to leafy greens, their goal is zero. And that concentration has to be zero. And that's why, for example, they want to treat, basically to drinking water standards. What we are trying to drive are risk assessments based on the numbers of these pathogens that we're finding, and what are the appropriate thresholds for those pathogens in the environment that bumps you up to a higher risk or a risk threshold that you're not willing to accept. So, for example, right, EPA, for exposure to water, we'll just say recreational exposure sets an acceptable limit of bacteria that we can find in that water source. From FDA's perspective, there is no acceptable level of pathogens in the environment or in a water source. And so, absolutely, I agree. Concentrations are meaningful, but it's a hard discussion to have with FDA.
Would hydroponic leafy greens have lower risk of pathogens?
That's a great question. So one would think so. However, recently we've seen a number of hydroponic leafy greens outbreaks that have occurred because of the recirculatory nature of their water systems. We also see biofilm formation is really big in hydroponic systems. So sometimes if you have plants that are kind of growing on these floating, they basically look like styrofoam platforms, and the roots might be dangling down into the water, and then plants might be sitting on the top. There's a lot of management and a lot of surface area that goes into those systems. And so when you do see the potential for pathogen introduction, that spreads really, really quickly, really because of the way that the water is moved and recirculated in those biofilms that have formed.
Are tribal partners and BOR actively participating in these mitigation measures?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. So because tribes are not subject to FSMA, so that's kind of one thing. They can voluntarily follow the Food Safety Modernization Act regulations from FDA, and a lot of them do, because the marketplace kind of drives that decision. So again, we'll just use Costco as an example. Again, they're going to say, we're not going to buy produce from anyone that is not adhering to FSMA standards. So that's one thing. But absolutely, I think we have a number of tribal partners that are fantastic about learning new practices. So we teach the Food Safety Modernization Act training, so they learn more about food safety. And we have a specific specialist that specifically tailors her content and trainings to those tribal partners. So absolutely.
And then our last question here says, I may have missed this, the presumption that application on periods of before harvest, what pathogens or concentrations would slant that?
So I don't know if I understand the question completely, but I'll just say, our concerns, again, are exposure of pathogens onto produce probably within 7 to 10 days of harvest. Likely what we see is that pretty quickly some of these pathogens that are exposed to the leaf surface will die off pretty rapidly, as long as the moisture is not kind of maintained. And so again, it's going to be site specific. The FDA does allow half a log, so 0.5 log die off per day for up to 4 days. So theoretically, if you had an exposure within 4 days, most of those pathogens would die off within that given period of time. However, concentrations matter. And if it's a really high loading event, you would suspect that 4 days would not be sufficient for adequate die off.
Awesome. That wraps up our questions. Thank you so much, Channah, for sharing your fantastic presentation with us today. And thank you for sharing your time as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Have a great conference.
Awesome. Thank you.